The night my daughter-in-law carried my blankets down to the basement, she did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply looked at me and said, "You're sleeping downstairs now, Margaret. This room is needed for my family." My son was standing only a few feet away, and the hardest part was not what she said. It was watching him turn his eyes toward the floor and say nothing. Before we continue, if this story speaks to your heart, I would love to know where you are watching from. Share your city or country and your local time in the comments, only if this story truly resonates with you. My name is Margaret Elaine Whitmore. I am 71 years old, and that evening in my home in Savannah, Georgia, changed the way I looked at my family forever. I had spent most of my life believing that love meant making room for the people you cared about. I believed patience could heal misunderstandings. I believed family would always remember the years you spent, giving everything you had. But that night, standing at the top of my own staircase, I realized that sometimes the people closest to you can forget the sacrifices you made. My husband Daniel and I bought that house almost 25 years earlier. It was not a mansion. It was a simple 2-story home with white columns on the front porch and a small garden where I planted roses every spring. Every corner carried a memory. The kitchen where I made pancakes for my son Ethan before school. The living room where Daniel and I opened Christmas presents for 30 years. The hallway where I watched Ethan leave for college, with a backpack over his shoulder and tears in his eyes. After Daniel passed away 6 years ago, that house became more than a place to live. It became the place where I kept pieces of the life we built together. I never expected that one day I would feel like a guest inside it. That evening, I was folding laundry in my bedroom when Claire, my daughter-in-law, walked in carrying a stack of blankets. She placed them on the floor beside my door. "Claire, what is this?" I asked quietly. She took a breath, almost as if she had rehearsed the conversation. "Margaret, Ethan and I talked about it. We need more space upstairs. The baby is coming, and the bedrooms need to be rearranged." I looked toward my son. "Ethan?" He stood near the window, his hands in his pockets. "Mom, it's just temporary," he said. "You know how things are right now. Temporary." That word stayed with me. I looked at the blankets on the floor, my old quilt, the one Daniel gave me on our 20th anniversary, the one I kept folded at the end of my bed for years. Claire picked it up and started walking toward the stairs. "The basement has a bed. It's comfortable enough." I followed slowly, not because I agreed, but because I needed to understand what was happening. The basement smelled different, cooler, darker. The small room had a narrow bed, a lamp, and a shelf filled with old boxes. Claire placed my blankets down and turned around. "I hope you understand. This is what makes sense for everyone." I wanted to ask Ethan when exactly I stopped being part of everyone. I wanted to ask him when my home became something I had to earn a place in, but I said nothing. I simply watched. After they left, I sat on the edge of that basement bed and listened to their footsteps disappear upstairs. A few minutes later, I heard laughter. Their laughter. I looked around the small room, then reached into the pocket of my cardigan and touched something I had carried with me for years. A small piece of paper with a name and a phone number written in my handwriting. I had hoped I would never need to use it. But that night, for the first time, I wondered if waiting quietly had been a mistake. I picked up my phone and stared at the number, and before I pressed call, I whispered something to myself that no one upstairs knew. They believed they had moved me downstairs. They had no idea what I had been protecting all this time. For several minutes, I sat there in the quiet of that basement room, holding my phone in my hand, but not making the call. I was not afraid of speaking. I was afraid of what the answer might mean. Sometimes the hardest moments in life are not the ones where someone hurts you. They are the moments when you realize you have been ignoring the signs for a long time. I placed the phone beside me and looked around the small room. The boxes on the shelves were filled with pieces of my past. Old photo albums, Daniel's handwritten notes, Christmas decorations we had collected over the years. Things that most people would consider ordinary, but to me, they were reminders of a life that had meaning. I was never someone who measured happiness by the size of a house or the amount of money in a bank account. I measured it by the little things: a warm meal on the table, a conversation after a long day, hearing someone you love laugh from another room. That was the kind of life Daniel and I built together. Simple, steady, full of effort. I met Daniel when I was 32 years old. I was working as a school secretary in Savannah, and he was repairing old homes around the city. He used to tell me that every house had a story if you paid attention. "Walls remember things, Margaret," he would say while we walked through old neighborhoods on Sunday afternoons. "They remember the people who cared for them." I never forgot those words because I believed people were the same way. We remember who cared for us. We remember who stayed when things were difficult. When Ethan was born, our world changed completely. Daniel and I were not perfect parents, but we tried. We worked extra hours. We saved carefully. We made sacrifices without keeping score. When Ethan wanted to play baseball, Daniel took him to every practice, even after working all day. When Ethan needed help with school projects, I stayed up late cutting paper, painting posters, and making sure he never felt alone. After Daniel passed away, Ethan became the person I worried about the most. Losing his father was hard on him. I understood that. I wanted to be the person who gave him stability when everything else felt uncertain. That was why, when Ethan told me he was getting married to Claire, I truly wanted to welcome her into our family. I remember the first dinner we had together. Claire was polite and charming. She brought a bottle of wine and thanked me for cooking. "I can see where Ethan gets his kindness from," she told me. I smiled because I wanted to believe her. Later, when Ethan called me after dinner, he said, "Mom, I think you and Claire are really going to get along." And I wanted that more than anything. I wanted my son to have a happy marriage. I wanted our family to grow. But over time, small things began to change, not big enough for me to complain about. Not big enough for me to admit that something was wrong. A comment here, a decision made without asking me there, a quiet feeling that my opinion mattered a little less each time. My friend Susan noticed it before I did. One afternoon, while we were drinking coffee at a small cafe near Forsyth Park, she looked at me and said, "Margaret, are you sure you are comfortable with everything happening at home?" I laughed softly. "Susan, they are family. Families adjust." She stirred her coffee and looked at me for a long moment. "Sometimes people ask you to adjust so many times that you forget you are allowed to stand still." I did not answer her that day. I thought she was being too protective. I thought I was being patient. But sitting alone in that basement, I started remembering moments I had chosen to overlook. Moments that suddenly felt different. Because the truth was, the night Claire moved my things downstairs was not the first time I felt like I was slowly disappearing inside my own family. After that conversation with Susan, I tried to convince myself that I was simply adjusting to a new chapter of life. Families change. People grow older. Children build their own lives. I had always believed that a mother's job was not to hold on tightly, but to know when to step back. What I did not realize was that there is a difference between giving someone space and allowing yourself to slowly disappear. The first time I noticed it was happening was not through a big argument. It was something much smaller. A Saturday morning when I walked into my kitchen and found that Claire had replaced my collection of blue ceramic plates with a new set of white dishes. I stood there for a moment, holding the old wooden spoon Daniel had carved for me years earlier. "Oh, Margaret," Claire said from behind me, "I hope you do not mind." Those old plates made the kitchen look dated. I turned around and smiled politely. They were a gift from Daniel's mother. Claire looked at the plates stacked in a box near the pantry. I understand, but we are trying to create a different feeling in the house. That word stayed with me. Not because it was wrong. Ethan and Claire were married. They were building a life together. But slowly, that word seemed to include everyone except me. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself not to be sensitive. But then came the little decisions that were always made without me. Claire changed the curtains in the living room because she said they were too old-fashioned. She rearranged the furniture without asking because she wanted a more modern layout. She started referring to parts of the house as our space when talking about things that had once been mine. One afternoon, I found her going through a cabinet where I kept Daniel's old photographs. "Claire, were you looking for something?" I asked. She closed the drawer calmly. "I was just organizing. There is so much unnecessary stuff here." I looked at the photographs in her hands. "Those are memories." She gave a small smile. "I know, but sometimes people hold on to things longer than they should." I did not answer. I simply took the photographs back and placed them carefully on the shelf. That night, Ethan noticed I was quieter than usual. He sat across from me at the kitchen table while I poured tea. "Mom, Claire says you have been acting distant." I looked at him. "Has she told you why?" He looked uncomfortable. "She says she feels like you are not accepting the changes." I almost laughed, but I stopped myself. "Ethan, changes are not the problem. Being forgotten is." He looked down at his hands. "Mom, she is trying to make this house feel like a home for us." "It has been a home for me for 25 years, I said softly. "And I want it to be a home for you too." That was the hardest part. I was not fighting against my son having a family. I was fighting against feeling like I no longer belonged in the family I created. As the months passed, Claire became more comfortable making decisions. She stopped asking and started announcing. She stopped suggesting and started instructing. But I remained calm. I continued making dinner. I continued watering the roses. I continued greeting Ethan with the same warmth I always had, because I still hoped he would notice. I still hoped he would remember. Then, one evening, Claire walked into the living room holding a folder. She placed it on the coffee table and looked at me with a confidence I had never seen before. "Margaret," she said, "we need to talk about how things are going to work from now on." The way she said those words made me put down my book. Something in her voice told me this was no longer about curtains, dishes, or furniture. This was about something much bigger. And for the first time, I wondered if she had been preparing for this conversation long before I knew it was coming. Claire sat across from me that evening with a folder resting neatly on the coffee table between us. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock Daniel had repaired with his own hands years before. I remember looking at that clock and thinking about how strange it was that something so small could keep moving forward while everything around it felt like it was changing. Ethan sat beside Claire, but he did not look at me. He kept his eyes on the folder. "Margaret," Claire began, folding her hands together, "I think we need to be realistic about the future." I waited. I had learned that sometimes people reveal more when you give them space to speak. "What does that mean?" I asked. Claire opened the folder but did not look at the papers inside. "It means this house is too much for one person." I felt my fingers tighten around my teacup, but I kept my voice calm. "I have lived here for 25 years. She nodded as if she understood, but her expression did not change. "I know, but things are different now. Ethan and I have a growing family. We need more room. We need to think about what makes sense." I looked at my son. "Ethan, is this what you think too?" He took a deep breath. "Mom, Claire is just trying to find a solution." "A solution to what?" I asked softly. "To me?" The silence that followed was longer than any answer he could have given. Claire leaned forward. Nobody is saying that. But you have to understand that the house has several rooms that are not being used efficiently. Used efficiently. Those words sounded so cold, like I was a piece of furniture taking up space. The rooms are not empty, I said. They are part of our home. Claire looked around the living room. Margaret, we are not trying to hurt you. We are trying to make decisions like a family. I almost smiled at that word again. Family. I wondered when decisions stopped being conversations and started becoming announcements. Over the next few days, small changes began happening faster. Claire started measuring spaces in the upstairs hallway. She moved some of Ethan's old boxes from the closet and told me she was creating options. When I asked what options meant, she simply replied, "You will understand soon." That sentence bothered me more than the changes themselves. It felt like something had already been decided without me. One afternoon, I found Ethan in the garage organizing tools. The smell of old wood and motor oil filled the air. I stood near the doorway and asked, "Are you and Claire planning something?" He stopped moving. "Mom," I waited. "She thinks we should make the upstairs bedrooms available." I stared at him. "Available for who?" He did not answer immediately. Then he said quietly, "For us." I felt something sink inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Something deeper. The feeling of realizing that someone you love has been standing on the other side of a door while you were still waiting for them to come back. "Ethan," I said, "when did you stop seeing this as my home?" He looked away. "That is not fair." "No," I replied gently. "What is not fair is making decisions about my life while telling me they are for my benefit." That night, I found a note taped to my bedroom door. It was written in Claire's handwriting. It was not a request, it was a plan. It explained that my room would be better used and that arrangements had already been made for me to move downstairs. I stood there holding that piece of paper for a long time. The house was silent. My hand trembled slightly, not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood something I had refused to accept. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision they had made without me. And as I folded the note and placed it in my pocket, I noticed something written at the bottom of the page that made me stop. Claire had included a date that was much earlier than the night she told me about the plan. The date at the bottom of Claire's note stayed in my mind long after I put the paper away. It was not just a date. It was proof that decisions had been made in rooms where I was not invited. For years, I had believed that being patient meant giving people the benefit of the doubt. But that night, sitting alone in my bedroom, I began to wonder if my silence had been mistaken for permission. The next morning, I woke up early, as I always did. At 6:00, I made coffee, opened the curtains, and watered the roses outside the kitchen window. I tried to hold on to the normal routines that reminded me who I was, but when I walked back inside, I noticed something different. My family photographs from the hallway had been moved, not thrown away, not damaged, just moved. They were placed inside a cardboard box near the stairs. I picked up the picture of Daniel and me on our 25th anniversary. We were standing in front of this very house, smiling like we had all the time in the world. "Looking for something?" Claire asked. I turned around and saw her standing in the doorway. "I was wondering why these were packed away." She walked over calmly. "I am reorganizing the hallway. It will look cleaner without all these old frames." I looked at the photograph in my hand. "They are not decorations, Claire. They are memories." She smiled slightly. "I know, but sometimes memories take up too much space." I did not respond. I had learned that some conversations were not meant to be won. They were meant to reveal something about the person standing across from you. Over the following weeks, the feeling of being pushed aside grew stronger. Claire began making decisions about the house as if she had already inherited it. She changed the grocery list. She moved items in the kitchen cabinets. She told guests which rooms they could use. When I asked questions, she answered with the same calm confidence. It is just easier this way. One afternoon, my neighbor Linda stopped by with a homemade apple pie. She had known me for almost 15 years. She immediately noticed that something felt different. "Margaret, where is your sewing chair?" she asked. I looked toward the corner where it used to sit. Claire moved it to storage. Linda lowered her voice. "Did you ask her to?" I shook my head. She looked at me with concern. "Are you okay?" I smiled because that was what I had always done. "I am fine." But even saying those words felt heavier than before. A few days later, Claire invited her parents over to see the house. I did not think much of it until I walked into the living room and heard her explaining the upstairs layout. "This room will be perfect for my mother," she said. I stopped at the doorway. Claire looked at me, then continued speaking as if I was not there. "And we can finally make better use of the space." Her mother nodded approvingly. "It is a beautiful home. You are lucky to have found such a place." Such a place. I stood there quietly, listening to people discuss my home as if I were only a visitor. Later that evening, I spoke to Ethan in the kitchen. "Did you know Claire was showing your parents the upstairs rooms?" He looked uncomfortable. "Mom, please." "Please what, Ethan?" I asked. "Please do not make me choose sides." I looked at him for a long moment. "I am not asking you to choose sides. I am asking you to see what is happening." He rubbed his forehead. "You know Claire is under a lot of stress." I nodded slowly. "And what about me?" He had no answer. That silence hurt more than any argument could have. That night, Claire came to my door, holding a small box. She placed it beside me and said, "I think it is time we made the transition easier." Inside the box were some of my personal belongings from upstairs. My favorite books, a few photographs, the small lamp Daniel bought me on our first anniversary. I looked at the box, then at Claire. "You already started moving my things?" She did not deny it. "We are trying to avoid unnecessary emotions." I took a slow breath. I wanted to ask how removing someone from their own life could ever be called avoiding emotions, but I stayed quiet. After she left, I sat on my bed and looked at the box beside me. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what was happening. This was no longer about a room. It was about whether I still had a place in the family I had spent my entire life building. Then, as I opened the box, I found something underneath my belongings that Claire had not noticed. A small envelope. An envelope that had been hidden there for years. And when I saw the name written across the front, I realized the past I had tried to leave behind was about to return. For a long time, I simply looked at that envelope sitting in my hands. I did not open it right away. Not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I knew some things in life cannot be unseen once you discover them. The handwriting on the front was familiar. I had seen it many times before. It belonged to someone who had shaped the person I became. I placed the envelope on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. That night, I barely slept. Not because of the basement, not because of the changes happening around me. I was thinking about all the moments when I had chosen peace over confrontation. All the times I had swallowed my feelings because I believed keeping a family together was more important than proving I was right. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and watched the light slowly enter through the windows. This was the same table where Daniel and I had planned our future, the same place where Ethan had done his homework as a child. For the first time in weeks, I asked myself a question I had avoided. "Margaret, what are you willing to lose to protect your own dignity?" The answer came quietly. I was not willing to lose myself anymore. That morning, Claire walked into the kitchen wearing a confident smile. She seemed lighter, almost relieved. "Good morning," she said. "I hope you slept well." I looked at her for a moment. "I did." She poured herself coffee without asking. "I wanted to let you know that the upstairs changes will begin next week. Ethan and I have already talked to the contractor." I kept my hands around my coffee cup. "The contractor?" "Yes. We are going to make the rooms more functional." She said it so naturally, like the decision had never belonged to me. "Claire," I said softly, "have you considered asking me before making changes to my home?" She paused briefly, then smiled. "Margaret, I think you are looking at this emotionally. We are trying to help you. Help me." Another phrase that sounded kind but carried a completely different meaning. Before I could respond, Ethan entered the kitchen. He looked tired. He avoided eye contact. "Mom, Claire is right. Maybe this is a good time for everyone to adjust." Everyone, that word again. I looked at my son and felt a sadness deeper than anger, because anger meant there was still a fight left in me. What I felt was disappointment. "Ethan," I said, "when you were young and you made mistakes, did I ever make you feel like you were a burden?" His expression changed slightly. "No." "Then why am I starting to feel that way now?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Claire stepped in quickly. "This conversation is becoming unnecessary." I looked at her. Maybe because nobody wants to have the necessary one. The room became quiet. It was the first time I had spoken those words out loud, not with anger, not with bitterness, just truth. Later that afternoon, I walked through every room of my house slowly. I touched the wooden railing Daniel had installed himself. I looked at the marks on the doorway, where we measured Ethan's height as he grew. I realized something important. My home was not just walls and furniture, it was a record of my life, and no one had the right to make me feel invisible inside my own story. That evening, I finally picked up the envelope again. I held it carefully between my fingers. Before I opened it, I placed it back in the drawer. Not yet. I needed to make one more decision first. I opened my phone and looked at the number I had saved years ago. My finger hovered over the screen. I was still the same Margaret who believed in kindness. I was still the same woman who wanted peace. But I was also a woman who had spent a lifetime protecting others. Maybe it was time to protect myself. I pressed the number and waited. When the call connected, I heard a familiar voice on the other end. "Margaret? I was wondering when you would finally call." I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. I knew then that the next step would change everything. But before I could explain why I was calling, the voice on the other end said something that made me sit up straight. The voice on the other end of the phone belonged to Thomas Bennett, a man I had known for almost 20 years. Daniel trusted him with important matters, and after Daniel passed away, Thomas was one of the few people who understood the choices we had made over the years. I sat quietly at the kitchen table, watching the morning light move across the floor while I listened to his calm voice. "Margaret, I have been wondering if this day would come," he said. I held the phone closer. I hoped it never would. There was a pause. Sometimes the things we hope never happen are the things that show us what we need to do. I looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals, the same place where I had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and ordinary Tuesday nights. "Thomas," I said, "I need your advice." "Not as a friend," he replied gently. "As someone who knows the documents and understands your situation." Those words gave me a strange sense of comfort. Not because I wanted a battle, I did not. I had spent my entire life avoiding unnecessary conflict, but I was beginning to understand that protecting peace does not mean surrendering your dignity. "I need to know what my options are," I told him. I think it is time I understood everything clearly. That afternoon I drove to a small office downtown near the Savannah River. The streets were familiar, the old brick buildings, The trees lining the sidewalks, the places I had passed hundreds of times without ever noticing. But that day, everything felt different. I was no longer walking through the city as someone waiting for others to make decisions for her. Thomas greeted me at the door with a warm smile. "Margaret." "Thomas," he looked at me carefully. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I sat across from his desk and took a breath. "I do not want revenge. I do not want anyone hurt. I just want the truth to have a place in this conversation." He nodded slowly. "That is exactly why I respect you." We spent the next few hours reviewing papers, dates, and information I had not looked at in years. Thomas asked questions. I answered honestly. Some memories were difficult. Some were comforting. But with every detail, I felt something returning that I thought I had lost. Confidence. Not anger, not bitterness, just clarity. Before I left, Thomas placed a folder on the desk. "Margaret, there is something you need to understand. Before any decisions are made, there are a few things Ethan and Claire need to know." I looked at the folder but did not open it. "Will they find out soon?" I asked. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Sooner than they expect." I returned home that evening before anyone noticed I had been gone. Claire was in the living room looking at paint samples. Ethan was sitting beside her, scrolling through his phone. Neither of them asked where I had been. That hurt, but strangely, it did not break me anymore. I walked past them calmly and placed my purse on the table. Claire glanced at me. "Margaret, we need your answer about the room tomorrow." I looked at her and smiled softly. "You will have my answer." She seemed satisfied, almost certain she already knew what I would say. But she did not know where I had been. She did not know who I had spoken to. And she did not know that for the first time in months, I was no longer waiting for someone else to recognize my worth. That night, after everyone went to sleep, I opened the folder Thomas gave me. Inside was not just information. It was a reminder of a promise made long before Claire ever walked into our lives. Then I noticed one document at the bottom of the folder, a document with a date that made me stop breathing for a moment. It was signed years before my son's wedding, and it explained why Daniel had always told me, "Margaret, keep this safe. One day you may need it." The document at the bottom of the folder was only one page, but I stared at it for what felt like hours. The paper itself was not special. It was just a few paragraphs, a signature, and a date from many years ago. But sometimes a simple piece of paper carries the weight of an entire lifetime. I carefully placed it back inside the folder and closed it. I was not ready to reveal anything yet, not because I wanted to keep secrets forever, but because I knew the truth needed to arrive at the right moment. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel like I was reacting to someone else's decisions. I had a plan. It was not a plan to hurt anyone. It was a plan to make sure my voice was finally part of the conversation. Before breakfast, I received a message from Thomas asking me to stop by his office again. When I arrived, he already had several documents arranged neatly on his desk. "Margaret, I want you to understand something," he said. "The strongest position is not always the one that makes the most noise. Sometimes it is the one that simply has the facts." I nodded. "That is all I want, the facts." He opened the first folder. We reviewed dates, signatures, and records. Every question I had carried quietly for years finally had a place to be answered. I listened carefully, taking notes in the small notebook I always carried in my purse. Thomas smiled when he saw it. "You still take notes like you did when you were teaching," I smiled back. A good teacher never stops learning. For a moment, I forgot about the situation at home. I forgot about the tension. I was simply Margaret again, the woman who spent 40 years helping children learn how to read, write, and believe in themselves. Before I left, Thomas handed me a copy of a document. "Keep this somewhere safe," he said. "And do not discuss these details with Ethan or Claire yet." I looked at him. "Why?" He paused. "Because right now they believe they understand the entire situation. Let them continue believing that. Their choices will tell us everything we need to know." Those words stayed with me. Their choices, not their excuses, not their explanations. Their choices. When I returned home, Claire was already making plans. She had paint samples spread across the dining room table. Ethan was looking at furniture catalogs on his laptop. They looked comfortable, almost peaceful, almost like they had already moved into a future where I was only a small detail to be arranged. Claire looked up. "Margaret, we were hoping you could start moving your things this weekend." I placed my keys on the counter. "I will handle my things when I am ready." Her expression changed slightly. It was the first time I had not immediately agreed. "I thought we discussed this." "You discussed it," I replied gently. I listened. Ethan looked up from his laptop. For a moment, I saw the uncertainty in his face, a small crack in the confidence he had been carrying. "Mom, why are you making this difficult?" I looked at him. "I am not making anything difficult, Ethan. I am simply no longer pretending that everything is fine." The room became quiet. Claire gathered the paint samples and walked away without responding. Later that evening, I sat in my room and placed the documents in a safe place. I looked around at the walls, the photographs, the memories. I was not preparing to destroy anything. I was preparing to protect something. My peace, my dignity, my life. The following day, Thomas called me with an update. His voice sounded more serious than before. "Margaret, I found something else while reviewing the records." I sat down slowly. "What did you find?" There was a pause. Then he said, "Something that changes the reason behind Claire's confidence." I looked toward the staircase leading upstairs. The house was quiet. Everyone was asleep. But suddenly, I realized the people who thought they were controlling the future might not know the full story of the past. "What is it, Thomas?" I asked. His answer was quiet. "Margaret, before I tell you, I need you to understand one thing. This was never just about a room." Thomas called me back that evening, and I could hear the seriousness in his voice before he even finished saying my name. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights turned low, the same place where I had spent so many nights planning meals, writing grocery lists, and sharing quiet conversations with Daniel. But this time, I was not thinking about dinner or tomorrow's errands. I was listening to a truth that had been waiting for years. "Margaret," Thomas said, "before I explain what I found, I need you to remember something. Daniel was not a careless man. He planned carefully, especially when it came to protecting the people he loved." I looked down at my hands. "I know." I smiled sadly. "That was one of the things I admired about him," Thomas continued. "When Daniel made certain decisions about the house, he did not do it because he expected problems. He did it because he understood that life can change unexpectedly." I felt my heart beat faster. "What decisions?" There was a short pause. "The documents show that Daniel made sure your ownership and your rights were clearly protected." I closed my eyes for a moment. The words were simple, but they carried a weight I had not expected. For years, I had never questioned what Daniel had arranged. We trusted each other completely. Our marriage was built on conversations, not paperwork. But hearing that he had quietly prepared something made me realize there were parts of our future he had considered that he never told me about. "Why did he never tell me?" I asked. Thomas's voice softened. "Because he knew you, Margaret. He knew you would focus on keeping the family together before thinking about yourself." That sentence stayed with me, because it was true. I had spent years making sure everyone else was comfortable. I had never imagined that one day I would need protection from the people I loved most. The next morning, Thomas met me at the house. I did not tell Ethan or Claire he was coming. I wanted to see their reactions naturally. When the doorbell rang, Claire was the first one to reach the entrance. She opened the door with a polite smile, but that smile disappeared when she saw Thomas standing there. "Mr. Bennett?" she said. "What brings you here?" Thomas remained calm. "I need to speak with Margaret and the family." Ethan walked over. "Is something wrong?" Thomas looked at him. "That depends on what you believe is happening." The room became quiet. I stood near the hallway, watching. For the first time in weeks, I was not the only person carrying the weight of the conversation. Thomas placed a folder on the dining table. "I believe there are some misunderstandings about this home and about Margaret's position." Claire immediately looked uncomfortable. "Misunderstandings?" she repeated. "We have already made arrangements." Thomas looked at her carefully. "Arrangements based on what information?" She did not answer. Ethan looked between us. "Mom, what is going on?" I looked at my son, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to run through this same hallway with muddy shoes after playing outside. "I think," I said quietly, "that we are about to understand some things that were never discussed." Thomas opened the folder but did not remove the final document. "Not yet." "Before we continue," he said, "there is one thing everyone should know." Claire crossed her arms. "And what is that?" Thomas looked at the papers in front of him. This house was never something that could simply be taken over by a family decision. The confidence on Claire's face changed, only slightly, but I noticed. Ethan noticed too. Then Thomas reached for another envelope inside the folder. He looked at the date and became silent for a moment. "Margaret," he said, "there is something else Daniel left behind that even you were not aware of." Thomas slowly placed the second envelope on the dining table. The room was completely quiet. Even the small sounds of everyday life seemed to disappear. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the clock on the wall, the soft movement of the curtains near the window. Everyone was waiting, but unlike the weeks before, I was no longer the person standing alone, trying to explain why something felt wrong. The truth was sitting in front of all of us. Thomas looked at Ethan first. "Before I open this, I want everyone to understand something. This is not about punishment. It is not about taking anything away from anyone. It is about honoring decisions that were made long before today." Claire's expression became more guarded. "I do not understand why this is necessary. We were only trying to make the house work better for everyone." Thomas nodded politely. "I understand. That is how you see it. But intentions do not replace legal agreements." He opened the envelope carefully and removed several pages. "Daniel prepared these documents 8 years ago." Ethan looked confused. 8 years ago? Why would Dad do that? Thomas glanced at me. "Because your father knew your mother. He knew she would always put everyone else first." I looked down at the table. Hearing Daniel's name still carried both comfort and pain. Thomas continued. "When Margaret and Daniel purchased this home, they structured ownership clearly. After Daniel passed away, the property remained under Margaret's full legal ownership. There was never any transfer of ownership to Ethan. There was never any agreement giving another family member the right to make decisions about the property." The room changed. Not dramatically, not with shouting, just a quiet shift, the kind of silence that comes when people realize the story they believed was incomplete. Claire looked at Ethan. "You told me this was a family home." Ethan's face changed. "I thought it was." Thomas placed another document on the table. "That is why this conversation matters. Believing something and having a legal right to something are not the same." I watched my son absorb those words. He looked older in that moment. Not because of age, but because he was finally facing something he had avoided. "Mom," he said quietly, "why did you never tell me?" I looked at him. "Because I never wanted you to see your father's home as something you were entitled to. I wanted you to see it as a place where you were loved." Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he looked less defensive and more uncertain. Claire, however, was still trying to hold on to control. But we have already made plans. We spent money. We made arrangements. Thomas nodded. And those choices were made without the legal authority to make them. He paused. That is something you will need to address yourselves. I felt no satisfaction from those words. No desire to see anyone embarrassed. I only felt relief. Relief that I no longer had to prove my own reality. The same woman who had spent weeks quietly listening was finally being heard. Thomas gathered the documents and turned to me. There is one more thing, Margaret. I looked at him. What is it? He hesitated. Daniel left instructions that were not meant to be shared unless this exact situation occurred. I felt my heart slow. What instructions? Thomas looked toward the folder. Your husband prepared something that would protect not only the house but your future. I looked at Ethan, then at Claire. The room felt different now. The power that had once belonged to their confidence was gone. But I knew the hardest part was not proving the truth. It was deciding what to do with it. And when Thomas placed the final document in front of me, I saw a name written at the bottom that I had not expected to see. It was not mine. It was Ethan's. And beside it was a condition Daniel had written years before anyone knew this day would come. Thomas gave me time before opening the final document. He did not rush the moment. That was one of the things I always respected about him. He understood that some truths needed space before they could be accepted. The papers in front of me were not just legal documents. They represented years of decisions, conversations, and promises that Daniel and I had made quietly when no one else was watching. Thomas looked at Ethan. Your father wanted you to have the opportunity to build your own life, but he also wanted you to understand responsibility. Ethan looked confused. What does that mean? Thomas placed the document in front of him. Daniel created a condition for any future transfer of ownership. He wanted the house to remain protected unless certain expectations were met. Ethan read silently for a moment. Then his expression changed. He wanted me to understand that this was Mom's home first. Thomas nodded. Exactly. I watched my son run his hand through his hair. For the first time, I saw him not as the man who had stood quietly while I was pushed aside, but as someone finally forced to look honestly at his own choices. I did not know, Ethan whispered. I answered softly, That is because you never asked. The words were painful, but they were true. Claire sat quietly across from us. The confidence she had carried for weeks was gone. She looked at the documents again, then at the room around her. The same room where she had once discussed changes and plans as if the future was already decided. So what happens now? She asked. Thomas closed the folder. Now everyone respects the legal boundaries that were ignored. There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just facts, and sometimes facts are more powerful than any argument. In the days that followed, things changed naturally. The contractor who had been scheduled to begin renovations was canceled. The plans for changing the upstairs rooms stopped. The conversations that once happened without me now included me. But the consequences were not something I created. They came from the choices they had already made. Claire had spent weeks acting with certainty because she believed she understood the situation. She had made promises to her parents. She had spoken to friends about the changes coming to the house. She had built a future around assumptions instead of facts. When those assumptions disappeared, she had to explain them herself. One afternoon, I overheard her speaking quietly with her mother on the phone. I thought everything was already settled, she said. I thought we had a plan. There was a long pause. No, I know I should have asked first. For the first time, I heard something different in Claire's voice. Not anger, not control, regret. Later that evening, Ethan came to my room. He stood in the doorway for a moment, almost like he was unsure if he was welcome. "Mom?" I looked up from my book. "Come in." He sat down slowly. "I owe you an apology." I did not answer immediately. I wanted him to understand that apologies were not just words. "For what?" I asked. He looked down. "For letting things happen because I thought staying quiet would keep peace." His voice became softer. "I did not realize my silence was hurting you." I nodded. Sometimes silence feels peaceful to the person avoiding the problem, but it can feel very lonely to the person carrying it. He wiped his eyes and looked away. I wish I had seen it sooner. I believed he meant that. But healing trust was not something that happened in one conversation. It was something rebuilt slowly. Claire eventually apologized too. It was not perfect. It was not a dramatic moment. It was simply a quiet conversation in the kitchen one morning. "Margaret," she said, "I was so focused on creating the life I wanted that I stopped seeing the person who was already there." I listened. I accepted her apology. But I also understood something important. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant releasing the weight of what happened. A few weeks later, I stood in my bedroom and opened the windows to let fresh air in. The room looked the same, but I felt different. The house was quiet again, not empty, peaceful. And for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I was ready to rebuild. Months passed after that difficult season in my life, and slowly, the house began to feel like mine again. Not because anything about the walls had changed, but because I had changed. For so long, I had been trying to prove that I deserved kindness, respect, and a place in the family I had spent decades building. I finally understood that those things were never something I had to earn. They were things every person deserves. I started with small things. I replanted the roses in the front garden because the old ones had become overgrown. I cleaned out the basement, not because I wanted to erase what happened there, but because I wanted to turn that space into something new. I filled it with shelves for my books, a small writing desk, and photographs of moments that reminded me of love instead of pain. It became a room of peace, not a room of loneliness. Ethan and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. It was not instant. Trust rarely returns overnight, but he started showing up. He came by on Sunday afternoons. We drank coffee on the porch and talked about things we had avoided for too long. One morning while we were sitting outside, he looked at me and said, "Mom, I do not know if I can ever make up for the time I failed you." I smiled gently. "You cannot change the past, Ethan, but you can choose what you do with the future." He nodded, and for the first time in a long time, I saw my son not as someone who had disappointed me, but as someone who was learning. Claire's journey was different. She and I did not suddenly become inseparable. Life does not always work that way. But she began to understand the importance of respect. She returned the things she had moved without asking. She apologized when she was wrong. She learned that being part of a family does not mean taking control of everyone around you. It means caring enough to listen. I accepted her apology because I wanted peace, not because I wanted to pretend nothing happened. There is a difference between forgiveness and forgetting. Forgiveness allows your heart to move forward. Forgetting can sometimes leave you vulnerable to the same wounds. I continued building a life that belonged to me. I joined a local gardening group in Savannah. I started painting again. I spent afternoons with Susan at our favorite cafe near Forsyth Park, laughing about ordinary things. I discovered that independence does not mean being alone. It means knowing you are whole, even when others are not there to complete you. One quiet morning, almost a year after that night, I stood on my front porch holding a cup of coffee. The sun was rising over the neighborhood. The roses were blooming again. The same house that once felt like a place where I had lost myself now felt like a reminder that I had found my way back. I looked through the window and saw the life I had protected. Not a perfect life, not one without mistakes, but a real one, a peaceful one. And I thought about all the people who have ever felt invisible inside their own families. If you have ever been made to feel like you were too old, too quiet, or no longer important, I hope you remember this. Your value does not disappear because someone fails to see it. Set healthy boundaries. Protect your dignity. Keep kindness in your heart, but never abandon yourself. Your voice matters. Your story matters. If this story touched your heart, you are welcome to share your thoughts. Like this story, subscribe, and share it with someone who may need to hear these words today. The greatest lesson I learned was simple. Love is strongest when it includes respect, and peace begins when you finally remember your own worth. Thank you for listening to my story and allowing me to share a chapter of my life with you. I hope wherever you are, you find the courage to choose yourself with kindness, and I hope we meet again in another story soon.